And Paul here is addressing, he makes a shift, and he begins addressing questions that he received in a letter. And we know this because of verse 1, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. Okay, so the Corinthian church wrote, we don't know if they wrote Paul directly or wrote a letter to be carried to Paul, but either way, they're asking these questions, and so Paul is addressing them. I want to give the bigger backdrop to Corinthians just very briefly, but the next chapters are addressing marriage issues, and then he shifts into food sacrificed to idols, so idolatry. Both pretty big problems in the city of Corinth. As we mentioned before, paganism was very sexualized. It was probably far more common than not to do these fertility rituals, and that included promiscuity and temple prostitution. With that said, I think Charles made a very good point last week that there were things that even the pagans didn't condone. And that's what Paul addressed in chapter 5. He's like, you're doing things, these incestuous relationships, the pagans don't even condone that. And so you're outdoing the pagans in your sexual immorality. And Paul very clearly is opposed to that. He takes it very seriously because God takes it seriously. And so he wants to stop this. And so now they're writing about these marriage issues with that backdrop of sexual immorality. Here's what Paul says. We're just going to read it, and then I think I'll read the entire chapter, then we'll go back and kind of break it apart a little bit. It's a lengthy chapter, so here we go. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man to not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not as a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when you were called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was freed when he was called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become a bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you freed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you of that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and he has determined this in his heart, to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then, he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. All right, there's a lot in that chapter. He's clearly addressing a lot of questions that they had. This wasn't like one or two questions. They had a whole bunch of questions. And I think Paul systematically goes through and addresses them kind of one by one. The first being, they wrote, quote, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." So they're writing about chastity. So they're saying, is it true that it's good to not have sexual relations? What's Paul's answer? In a nutshell.
If you're married, it is good, not good.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if you're not married and you're not burning with passion, then yeah, celibacy is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, Paul, in his opinion, and he goes back and forth, like, this is my opinion, or this is what I say, I, not the Lord. And then he goes back and he says, now this is what God says. And so Paul is very clear to separate what he feels to be better, and then what's an actual commandment from God. And so I think that shows too that there is flexibility on God's part, that God's not this legalistic, commanding everybody has to be married, everybody has to have kids. And so for Paul, it's better to be unmarried. Why? He addresses this later on in chapter 7. Why does he say it's better to not be married?
Because you're a happier person unmarried than you are married, because when you're married you have more obligations and more things to take care of.
That's right. Yeah, your attention is divided. And people could look at that, and I've heard people argue about this, and they're like, oh, Paul's misogynistic, and Paul hates marriage, and Paul hates women, and I'm like, I don't really get that from Paul.
There's a second piece to that here. And I forget, I didn't study this before we came in, so I don't remember exactly what, but there was certainly something happening right then, at that point in time, that he's saying, hey, it's better to not, don't get yourself into this right now, because this time is gonna be bad. I don't remember if it was the person.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
right, yeah. So there are definitely issues going on, and that's pretty clear. Like from verse 1 in 1 Corinthians, you learn that, yeah, there's a whole lot going on in Corinth. But people don't know for sure what the issues were, that like why they were addressing these issues. But it almost appears that some people are coming in saying, like, no, you can't. If you're a Christian, you can't have sexual relations at all. You've got to devote your whole life to the Lord, including divorcing your current spouse. You've got to devote all your attention to God. And Paul's addressing that, like, no, it's not a sin to marry. For us, we're like, well, duh, but he's addressing a very specific set of problems. And, I think very clearly, my opinion, there were people in Corinth who were saying, if you're married, you're sinning because you're supposed to be completely devoted to the Lord. Sexuality is a distraction, even a sin. And Paul's saying, no, contextually, there's nothing wrong with it. If you're married, even if you're married to an unbeliever, remain as you are. But if that person, if the unbeliever wants to divorce you and leave, let them go. Why do you think Paul says that? If the unbeliever wants to leave, let them go.
I know it says that if the unbeliever is married to a holy person, he is holy also.
And the children, yeah, your children, yeah.
Is he giving them a way out?
I think Paul is not a fan of hostage taking. A lot of Christians do things for the sake of what's commanded in the Bible, and they'll hold people captive and hostage. And Paul's saying, no, that's not okay. And it's not okay either for the unbeliever to hold you hostage and to abuse you verbally, and trying to tell you how stupid your faith is, and how, if that's the case, then, and they want to go, let them go. Can you imagine? Like, I've seen marriages where this is the case, and it's not healthy, it's not good, and the reverse of that can be true too. If a believer is beating up their unbelieving spouse and abusing them verbally, and telling them that they have to become a Christian, and and just grinding them, I think the Bible's pretty clear about that too. Peter talks about it. He talks about winning your husband over with a quiet and gentle spirit. That's a much better option than beating them with the Bible, telling them that they're going to hell. And so Paul, for Paul, he talks about how when you're married, you're anxious about the things of the world. Is that a true statement for those of us who are married? Is our attention divided? Yeah, very much so, right? We are not missionaries at any cost. We are not going out there and spending every waking hour for the Lord, preaching to people. Why? Because we can't. I mean, that's just a fact. We can't. Our attention is absolutely divided. Is that a sin? Paul's pretty clear, not at all. He's just saying that if you really want to be effective and go out and spread the word, it's much better to remain single if you can. But if you're burning with passion, which I would probably argue would fall under the vast majority of people, it's better to get married. But if you can control your passions and you say that you want to be devoted to being single, that's better. Don't get married for the sake of getting married. Because people say it's better. Which is interesting, because what is the number one prerequisite for virtually every minister, period, across every denomination?
Faithful wife and 2.5 children.
That's right, a faithful wife and 2.5 faithful children. There are virtually no churches that will hire any single person to go into ministry, period. And that, to me, I think is a mistake, honestly. I know single people who remain single their entire lives. They never married. And you want to talk about devotion to God and ministry. Why? Because they're better Christians than married people? No, because they could.
Well, to me, what's a little confusing about the way Paul does this, and as he goes through it, or I mean, not confusing, but what we get confused on, is that he's addressing both two sides of the equation and going back and forth, and then giving God's statement versus his opinion. But the two sides of the coin here are, one, it's better to not be married because you can focus everything into doing God's work.
Yeah.
The second one is, but on the flip side, and we see this in various groups that forbid marriage for their leaders or whatever, what happens whenever you put people in that situation? I mean, like, you see it. You get sexual immorality. It's just a different sort.
Yeah.
So he's addressing both sides, going back and forth and saying, well, this way's better, but because of our own problems and because of
That's right.
our desires, you can do this.
Well, and so Dr. Rick Oster, in his commentary on 1 Corinthians, he said it this way. He said, for Paul, celibacy is good, but the lack of sexual immorality is better. So, you know, and that's a tough one. I mean, admittedly, that's a tough one for churches, because when they hire a single person, they take on a lot of risk, because the question is that none of us will know. None of us except God himself will know this. Is that single person burning with passion secretly inside? Like, who knows? They can say that they don't, but
Just getting ready to say.
yeah.
Get married.
And that, I mean, it's kind of a catch-22, and, you know, we can simplify this as much as we want, but, you know, I think it's still a tough issue. These are tough issues Paul's addressing, and at the end of the day, Paul's overarching concern is not singleness or married or divorce and remarriage or whatever. Paul's issue is, are you refraining from sexual immorality? If you do that, you do the best. Out of all of these different scenarios, the best thing for everybody is to refrain from sexual immorality. And I'll address briefly the beginning of chapter 7, you know, this notion of husband and wife. Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. I've heard this used so many times, misused so many times, specifically almost always where men are misusing this, stripping it out of context to say, see, my wife has to give me sex, or she's sinning. That's not what Paul says. The issue here is communication and mutual communication, not that the wife owes the man sex and pleasure in bed. That's not what Paul's saying. In fact, Paul says the husband's wife does not belong to him. It belongs to the wife, and then the reverse of that, the wife's body doesn't belong to her, or she doesn't have authority over her body, the husband does. Well, that doesn't mean that we can do what we want with our spouse. That's not what Paul's saying. And so the issue here, the heart of the issue is communication and connection with each other, and most importantly, spiritual connection. But there is, there is an issue of, or probably was an issue of withholding within the church for the purpose of holding that over the spouse's head, so to speak. And I think Paul's pretty clear about that. Martin Luther famously wrote something to this effect. He said something like, "If my wife is purposefully and continually unwilling, then send me the maid." Kind of an interesting take, but the issue, and what Martin Luther was saying, I think it falls in line with what Paul was saying, is that there are always going to be willing people out there, so don't go down that road. Don't allow those things to happen. Learn to communicate with each other. Learn to pray together. If you're gonna do this, if you're gonna withhold, so to speak, do that for the purpose of prayer, and for a short time, and then come back together and figure this out.
I think that there actually is an element of not withholding from. I mean, the Turner says don't withhold from each other there.
Yeah.
There is an element there, not that you have control and that you can force somebody into doing something or anything. It's more like working together.
That's right.
So it works as long as both people are working together.
And I think that's his whole point. Figure out how to work together, because if you don't want to go down that path. Like, it's not a good path, especially given the issues with sexual immorality and the pervasiveness of that. Because without coming right out and saying it, if your spouse isn't willing, somebody else will be, and that's not okay.
I think it's more than that. The withholding is a deliberate act
Yes.
for the purpose of control.
Yes. Agreed.
Would be then right.
And in that case, that withholding is, in my opinion, equally sexually immoral.
Yes.
So I don't think it's just, I think this is a leverage battle, if you will.
Yes. Agreed.
Paul's addressing that as well.
Yeah, I think what we can't do is put this in the context of not being in the mood, even if it's weeks at a time, being too tired, being too worn out, that's not what Paul's addressing here, and I agree with you. I think the issue is an intentional, willful, almost deceptive, manipulative withholding. That's what Paul's addressing. Yeah, don't do it. It's not going to end well, and it's not okay, and it's equally as sinful as sexual immorality. So I agree wholeheartedly with that. Okay, chapter 8, food offered to idols. I love this chapter. It's short, it's to the point. Let's jump right in. Now, concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Where do we hear Paul echo that again? Chapter 13, right? The love chapter. If anyone imagines, I love that. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. It's an illusion. If you're imagining that you know all this stuff, you don't know as much as you think you know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, one Father, from whom all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, one Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. Did Paul make it clear enough? It's pretty clear. Yeah, there are tons of gods, tons of supposed gods, both in the heavens and here on earth. But for us Christians, there's one Father, one God, one Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. We exist because of God and Christ, period. However, not all possess this knowledge, but some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. In other words, they can't separate the fact that this meat was offered to an idol. They think about it. They are offended by it. The opposite of that is that they eat it accepting that it's been offered to an idol, and therefore this meat has some sacred rite, ritual to it, and it's absolutely devoted to an idol. And so as a Christian, some Christians are okay with that, and other Christians are highly offended by that. They can't get out of their mind that idols are nothing, and so it really doesn't matter. If Jacob takes one of his cows from the herd and sacrifices it to an idol and dances around and spreads blood all over the place and then sells that meat to the market, would any of us have a violated conscience by eating that meat? Maybe. Some might. Others, I wouldn't. I'd be like, I don't care. Excuse me, idols are fake. I don't really care. And that's what Paul's addressing. Some are going to be offended by this, especially in Corinth. Some are going to be offended by this because they have a weak conscience. Verse 8, food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. We can't be commended to God by the food that we eat. We can't please God by the food that we eat or don't eat. You can't earn your way to God through our food. It doesn't matter. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. There's his point. For if anyone sees you who have no knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols? In other words, monkey see, monkey do. Somebody sees you eating meat offered to an idol, but in your own mind you're like, I don't care. Idols are fake. Whatever. It doesn't violate my conscience. And so you eat this meat, and your brother sees you eating this meat offered to a sacrifice. Will that not embolden the weaker brother to eat meat sacrificed to idols? The answer is yes. And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. So the issue is, do we eat meat anyway and just tell our brother who's offended by this, right? Have you ever met the person who's offended by everything? I have. That offends me. Like, I hear the voice, I can't help it. I hear the voice inside my head. That offends me, right? Like, it's annoying when somebody's offended by everything. But you know what Paul says? Doesn't matter. You who have the stronger conscience, don't intentionally do things that are going to offend or set a stumbling block in front of your brother. Christ died for them too. Right? The whiny voice, that offends me. Everything is offensive to them. I could give you tons of examples of this. Some of you are old enough to remember the mixed, it's such a bizarre term, mixed bathing days. Right? Tex knows. Yeah, church camp. You don't mix boys and girls swimming together because, like, they're going to make babies in the pool, I guess, or something. And so, you know, you separate them at all costs. Yeah, I mean, that was huge, and like I'd say the height of it was in the 80s and early 90s, where, you know, I think at Christian camps they still separate boys and girls, but it's not this big, like, they made such a big issue over it that, like, if they swam together, it was like the unforgivable sin. Like, you were absolutely going to hell if your toe touched the water where people of the opposite sex were in. Like, you were absolutely sinning, and so this was a big deal, you know. And those were things where, like, for me, I'm like, well, like, we went to the beach all the time, and it's so funny because, like, I had an argument with somebody that I went on a campaign with, and I loved this person, and, you know, we were friends, and but he was so adamant that I was living in sin, and he was like pointing out that I can't believe that you swam with people of the opposite sex, and that's just wrong, and you're sinning, and you need to repent, and, like, would not let it go. And I'm just like, it's not a big deal to me. It's really not. And so then the light bulb went off in my mind, and I shouldn't have done this. I should have been like, you know what, like, I respect your opinion. I'm not going to offer a stumbling block. I should have been a Paul. But what I did was I had this light bulb go off in my head because I heard this same person talking about how he just loves going to the beach. And I was like, the beach is just crammed full of men and women, boys and girls, all going into the ocean at the same time. And so I was like, when you go to the beach with your family, do you swim in the ocean? Oh, I love swimming in the ocean. I love the waves. I love just the peace of, you know, going and relaxing and hearing the waves. And yeah, why would I not swim when I go to the ocean? And I was like, interesting. And I did that to, like, prove a point, I guess, and get a little jab in. That I'm like, is that not mixed swimming? Well, that's different. I'm like, how is that different? That's not different at all. Like, the only difference is there are far more boys and girls together in one body of water than at the swimming pool. But he didn't see it that way, and, you know, I was not going to win an argument. I just, admittedly, I did it just to get a little jab in to show the ridiculousness of why he was so offended. But Paul says, don't do that. Like, I was kind of immature in doing that, I think, but...
I can't help myself here. Paul addresses the weaker brother, not, and maybe I'm splitting hairs here, so please feel free to tongue lash me.
Yeah.
He's not addressing the high and mighty, the absolute convicted and controlling brother. There are a lot of people who get offended real easily about a lot of things, and it has more to do with you will do it their way when they can't be your friend. I'm sorry.
That's a great point.
That's not a person who's weak. That's a person who's very strong and adamant.
Yeah.
Just wrong.
That's a great point.
If he's talking about somebody who you're going to cause to stumble.
Yeah,
on
yeah.
what you're doing, not somebody who is telling you you're wrong because of.
So, are we justifying me in making a point to my friend?
Now, your motive is your own. But
It was fun, though. I have to admit, it was a little bit fun to point that out.
those motives can be fun, but that's a different story. But is it wrong to look at someone and challenge the behavior they're doing while they're condemning you for doing the same thing? I don't think that's wrong at all.
Yeah.
We actually have to.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
otherwise we wouldn't be able to do anything. I mean, like
Yeah.
how many people are offended by somebody wearing shorts? How many people are offended by somebody eating in the building? I mean, like,
Yeah, right.
you wouldn't be able to do anything if every time somebody said, I'm offended by this, you didn't do it, or it bothers me, or whatever. I mean,
Yeah.
you just wouldn't be able to do anything.
I think that's a great point. If you didn't hear that online, the point Charles made was Paul's not addressing strong-willed people who disagree with everything and who are offended by everything and who you either do it my way or you're not really a Christian. Paul's not addressing those people. Paul's addressing the people who would stumble, who would fall into sin, who are kind of like, I almost take it as they're quiet participants. They're not raising a big deal. They're not flailing their arms and pointing and telling everybody they're going to hell in a handbasket. And these are people who they're weak-willed, and specifically, and again, I think we have to address the bigger issue. It's not mixed swimming. It's a bigger issue of meat that's been sacrificed to idols. That's a huge deal, especially in Corinth. This is a huge deal because the meat offered to idols and just pagan religion in general was so ingrained. It was part of their spiritual DNA. It was part of their makeup. They could not separate that from who they were. So it's not that they were pagan. Like, we use the term pagans now to talk about ungodly people. That's not who the pagans were. The pagans were very godly people. They were very religious people. They did all of these things to please or appease their gods. So the sexual immorality, they didn't look at it as like, oh, I'm going to do whatever I want and follow my passions. For them, it was linked to fertility. It was linked to appeasing the gods. It was linked to, they were very religious people. And so Paul makes the point, verse 12, thus sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So Paul's clear. It doesn't offend me. It doesn't bother me. They're just idols. They're sticks. They're blocks of wood or stone or whatever. These little idols, they don't matter. I can eat meat. I can eat meat that's been offered to idols. It doesn't bother me. But if it's going to bother my brother, I'll never eat meat again. And I think Paul's not exaggerating. I think Paul genuinely will never eat meat again. He's not going to do it. He's not going to cause his weaker brother to stumble. So, great points, great discussion. We're out of time. I'm on pace for my 2 chapters, not 3.
That's only because you skipped most of the 7.
I know. I did. That was such a long chapter. But we're out of time. We'll see you guys in a few minutes. Thank you.
By the blood of Jesus, he lost his power. I belong to Jesus, I belong to him. Christ was the